What if I told you that the same genius who discovered gravity spent more time trying to turn lead into gold than doing actual science? Or that the man who invented your breakfast cereal made it specifically to stop you from having SX? Or that a Harvard-trained doctor's official cure for mental illness was literally strapping patients to a spinning wheel and whirling them until they passed out? These aren't conspiracy theories. These are real, documented, peer-reviewed beliefs defended by the most celebrated scientific minds in history, and we found 111 of them. If your jaw isn't on the floor by number 5, you're built different. Smash that hype button right now, and let's send this to every science teacher who ever made you feel dumb, because today, the geniuses are the ones looking ridiculous. 1. Benjamin Rush was so convinced about bloodletting that he basically turned into a human drain for his patients. During the deadly 1793 Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic, Rush bled people until they nearly died, genuinely believing he was helping. Patients would come in sick and leave even closer to death, drained like a bathtub. Rush proudly defended this method while the bodies piled up around him. The man was so confident in his wrong answer that Philadelphia probably lost more people to the cure than the disease itself. 2. William Herschel was one of the greatest astronomers in history, which makes this so much better. He looked at dark sunspots on the sun and decided those were actually windows, holes revealing a cool, green, populated world hiding underneath all that fire. See, he genuinely believed real people were living inside the sun like it was some kind of flaming apartment building. Herschel discovered Uranus, mapped the stars, and then casually decided the giant burning nuclear fireball in our sky was somebody's cozy neighborhood. 3. Charles Darwin spent 40 years of his legendary scientific career passionately arguing that earthworms are smart enough to make actual architectural decisions. He watched them plug their burrows and genuinely believed they were choosing the best leaf shape for the job like tiny underground interior designers. The same man who figured out how all life on Earth evolved spent decades defending the intelligence of dirtworms. Darwin even wrote an entire book about it. His family reportedly thought he had lost his mind, and honestly, who could blame them? 4. Sigmund Freud discovered cocaine and immediately decided it was basically magic in powder form. He prescribed it for depression, anxiety, and even morphine addiction, calling it a miraculous cure while personally using it himself. Freud was literally handing out cocaine to patients like a doctor handing out vitamins, writing enthusiastic letters about how wonderful it made him feel. The father of modern psychology, the man who analyzed everyone else's deepest problems, spent years completely blind to the fact that his miracle cure was one of the most addictive substances on the planet. 5. John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes, and the entire reason is absolutely unhinged. He genuinely believed that bland, tasteless, boring food would stop Americans from having inappropriate thoughts. Kellogg was obsessed with suppressing what he called immoral urges and decided the breakfast table was his battlefield. He ran a sanitarium in Michigan where he controlled every meal with military precision, all in the name of keeping people's minds clean. So every time someone pours a bowl of cornflakes in the morning, they are technically eating a 19th century anti-desire medical device invented by a man who was extremely angry about human nature. 6. Antoine Lavoisier was the father of modern chemistry, a certified genius, and he stood before the French Academy of Sciences and announced with complete confidence that meteorites are scientifically impossible. His argument was simple. The sky has no rocks in it, therefore rocks cannot fall from the sky. Farmers and villagers kept reporting stones crashing from the heavens, and Lavoisier basically called them all liars. The greatest chemist of his era used his enormous scientific reputation to officially declare that space rocks do not exist, right up until space rocks kept existing anyway. 7. Edmund Halley, the man who predicted the return of the most famous comet in history, spent serious intellectual energy arguing that the Earth is completely hollow inside. Not just empty, but hollow with 3 separate nested shell planets stacked inside each other like a Russian doll, each one having its own atmosphere. He proposed this to explain why compass needles behave strangely and presented it as reasonable science. Halley got a comet named after him, and then spent his spare time drawing diagrams of the miniature solar system he believed was operating inside the ground beneath his feet. 8. Samuel Morton had a skull collection that would make anyone uncomfortable, and he used it to teach at top American universities that he had scientifically proven racial intelligence rankings through head measurements. He packed skulls with seeds, measured the volume, and published rankings as established science. The disturbing part is not just that he did it, but that respected institutions invited him back to do it again. Later, researchers reviewed his original data and found he had unconsciously fudged his own numbers to match what he already believed, making his scientific proof spectacularly unscientific. 9. Thomas Edison was supposed to be the hero of electricity, but he turned his war against Tesla into one of history's most bizarre public relations campaigns. Edison traveled around publicly electrocuting animals to prove that Tesla's alternating current was dangerous, including a circus elephant named Topsy, who was already scheduled to be put down. Edison filmed the whole elephant electrocution and showed it to audiences. Saw the greatest inventor in American history spent valuable time and money killing animals in public because he was losing a business argument about power cables. 10. René Descartes was one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, and he was completely convinced that animals feel absolutely nothing. He argued they are biological machines, like clocks made of meat, and their screams during vivisection were simply mechanical noise, not pain. Descartes and his colleagues cut open live dogs while they were still conscious and dismissed every cry as irrelevant sound. The man who gave the world the famous proof of his own existence through thinking apparently drew a hard line at extending that courtesy to any creature that was not him. 11. Galen was so respected in ancient medicine that doctors followed his teachings without question for over 1,400 years. His big contribution was confidently declaring that the liver, not the heart, runs the entire blood system. Physicians across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond repeated this as absolute fact for more than a millennium. Nobody checked, nobody questioned it. Galen said the liver was in charge, and 14 centuries of doctors just nodded along, treating patients based on information that was completely wrong while the heart sat there doing all the actual work the entire time. 12. Pliny the Elder wrote one of history's most ambitious encyclopedias covering all of known natural history, and right there between real animals he casually documented that basilisks kill people by making eye contact. Not a myth section, not a legends chapter, just listed alongside actual creatures as verified natural history. Pliny treated the death stare lizard with the same journalistic seriousness as horses and eagles. He died rushing toward the eruption of Vesuvius to observe it scientifically, which means the man brave enough to investigate a volcano somehow never stopped to question the murder lizard entry. 13. Wilhelm Reich was a trained scientist who became convinced that an invisible energy called orgone powered the entire universe. He built wooden boxes he called orgone accumulators and charged patients money to sit inside them, claiming the energy collected inside would cure cancer and fix their personal problems. Reich then decided orgone could also control weather and built a machine to shoot it at clouds. And the FDA eventually seized and destroyed his boxes. Reich died in federal prison, still completely certain that the wooden boxes were working and that the government was suppressing his universe-powering invisible energy discovery. 14. Isaac Newton is the most famous scientist in history, and the dirty secret is that physics was basically his side hobby. Newton spent far more of his actual lifetime obsessively practicing alchemy, trying to turn metals into gold, and decoding hidden prophecies he believed were buried inside the Bible. He wrote over 1 million words on biblical prophecy alone. The man who discovered gravity and invented calculus spent decades hunched over bubbling chemical pots and scripture manuscripts, convinced that the real secrets of the universe were hidden in ancient religious texts, waiting for someone smart enough to decode them. 15. Athanasius Kircher had an explanation for fossils that made complete sense to him and zero sense to anyone doing actual geology. He taught that fossils were God's failed practice sketches, rough drafts of creatures the Creator tried out and discarded before perfecting the real animals. So dinosaur bones were basically divine doodles, celestial prototypes that did not make the final cut. Kircher was a remarkably brilliant scholar who spoke 12 languages and built extraordinary machines. And he looked at the fossil record and concluded the Almighty had simply been warming up before getting to the good stuff. 16. Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's own cousin, and he took Darwin's ideas about natural selection and immediately decided humans should start doing it on purpose to themselves. He launched the eugenics movement, stood before the Royal Institution, and presented formal academic papers arguing that science could breed a superior human race within just a few generations if society made the right reproductive choices. Galton was celebrated, invited back, and treated as a serious visionary. He died respected and decorated, never fully understanding that he had just handed the world one of the most catastrophically dangerous ideas in modern history. 17. Nikola Tesla was standing inside his Colorado Springs laboratory during a massive thunderstorm when his equipment picked up repeating signal patterns he had never seen before. Tesla did not conclude it was interference or atmospheric noise. He concluded, with great excitement, that he had just received intelligent transmissions from Mars or Venus and announced it publicly. The man who literally invented the modern electrical system, who understood electromagnetic waves better than almost anyone alive, heard some static during a lightning storm, and decided extraterrestrials were trying to reach him personally through his coils. 18. Lord Kelvin was one of the most decorated physicists in Victorian Britain, and in 1895 he announced publicly that heavier-than-air flying machines are a complete physical impossibility. Not unlikely, not difficult, but impossible according to the laws of science as he understood them. He was confident enough to put his enormous scientific reputation behind the statement. 8 years later, Orville and Wilbur Wright, two bicycle mechanics from Ohio with no university degrees between them, flew a heavier-than-air machine at Kitty Hawk, and Lord Kelvin's impossibility lasted approximately one cold December morning in North Carolina. 19. Samuel Thompson built an entire medical empire on one single idea, and that idea was that all disease everywhere comes from being cold. Every illness, every condition, every symptom in Thompson's medical universe traced back to the body being too cold, and his complete cure for everything was cayenne pepper and steam baths. Fever, broken bones, infections, it did not matter. Heat it up and pour cayenne on it. Thompson had no medical training whatsoever but published his system, sold licenses to practice it across America, and thousands of people paid real money to be peppered and steamed into wellness. 20. Cesare Lombroso was Italy's most celebrated criminologist, and he published a scientific system for identifying criminals by their faces before they committed any crime. Protruding jaws, large ears, and unusual ear shapes were his published biological markers of born criminality. Lombroso believed criminals were evolutionary throwbacks, primitive humans who had not fully evolved, and their skulls proved it. He presented this to packed academic audiences across Europe and America who applauded enthusiastically. Courts began requesting his expert testimony. Law enforcement took notes. An entire generation of criminal justice policy was quietly shaped by a man reading ear shapes. 21. Louis Agassiz was America's most beloved scientist in the 1800s, and he had a remarkable solution to the problem of why similar animals appeared on separate continents after each ice age. God simply restocked everything. Agassiz argued that after every mass extinction event, the Creator personally repopulated each continent with fresh custom animals, making evolution geographically impossible by divine intervention. Harvard celebrated him, students worshipped him, and he used his enormous prestige to fight Darwin's evolution theory until his death, insisting that the planet ran on a cosmic restocking schedule managed from above. 22. James Hutton is considered the father of modern geology, and he invented an entire ocean that never existed to explain something that confused him. Granite kept appearing in rock formations in ways Hutton could not explain with his existing theories. So he proposed that a primordial ocean once covered everything and deposited the granite before vanishing completely without leaving a single trace of geological evidence. Hutton built the foundations of modern Earth science and then casually dropped a go-see into his model because the math needed it, and moved on like that was a completely normal scientific thing to do. 23. Charles Babbage invented the concept of the computer and spent his spare time developing what might be the most ambitious audio conspiracy theory in scientific history. See, he genuinely believed that every sound ever spoken is permanently stored in the air around us, vibrating invisibly forever. and that future technology would eventually develop sensitive enough instruments to replay those sounds. Babbage specifically mentioned that this meant the actual voice of Jesus Christ delivering the Sermon on the Mount was still technically floating around in the atmosphere somewhere, waiting for someone clever enough to build the right equipment to play it back. 24. Friedrich Wöhler was a serious and accomplished chemist who made genuine breakthroughs in organic chemistry, and he also maintained detailed scientific flavor notes on every element he discovered. Wöhler believed each pure element had a distinct and identifiable aroma that qualified as a legitimate chemical property worth cataloging. Yet he tasted and smelled his way through the periodic table with the same methodical dedication he brought to his actual chemistry. Nobody told him to stop. His colleagues apparently considered this reasonable scientific behavior, which says something interesting about 19th century laboratory culture and the absence of basic safety protocols. 25. Herbert Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest and then applied it to human economics with terrifying enthusiasm. Spencer argued that poverty is simply nature's quality control system, and that helping poor people survive interferes with civilization's natural improvement process. Letting the poor starve was not cruelty in Spencer's framework, it was biology doing its job. He published this, lectured on it across America to standing ovations from wealthy audiences, and became one of the most celebrated intellectuals of the Victorian era. Rich people absolutely loved the scientist who told them their wealth was proof of evolutionary superiority. 26. Johann Heinrich Lambert was a serious Swiss mathematician and astronomer who in 1761 published a book calmly arguing that the moon, every planet and every star in the sky, is inhabited by living creatures. Lambert did not stop at merely claiming they were inhabited. He attempted rough population estimates for several of them based on their surface areas and what he calculated as reasonable population densities. Lambert presented this as straightforward astronomical reasoning, the natural conclusion of a universe created for a purpose. His colleagues read it, nodded thoughtfully, and nobody suggested he might want to reconsider the population estimate chapter. 27. Franz Mesmer invented an entire medical system based on a substance that does not exist. He taught that invisible magnetic fluid flows through every human body, and that disruptions in this fluid cause all disease. His cure was waving magnets at patients while they sat around a wooden tub filled with iron filings. Mesmer performed these sessions in a dimly lit room wearing a silk robe, which really committed to the atmosphere. Remarkably, patients reported feeling better. A Royal French Commission investigated, concluded the magnetic fluid was fictional, and Mesmer fled Paris. His name survives in the word mesmerized, which is at least something. 28. Granville Stanley Hall was one of America's most respected psychologists, and he published a formal medical warning that women reading novels faced serious health consequences. Not eye strain, not distraction. Hall argued that novels caused nervous breakdowns, triggered infertility, and produced permanent brain damage in female readers. He presented this as medical science backed by his clinical observations. Hall founded the American Psychological Association, mentored an entire generation of American psychologists, and spent part of his distinguished career trying to get women to put down their fiction before their reproductive systems suffered irreversible literary damage. 29. Guglielmo Marconi invented the radio and then immediately used it to embarrass himself on an international stage. So after detecting repeating signal patterns in his receiver that he could not immediately explain, Marconi called a press conference and announced to the world that he was picking up intelligent transmissions from Mars. Not privately wondering about it, not cautiously mentioning it to colleagues, but a full press conference. The man who had just given humanity wireless communication used his moment of global scientific celebrity to tell reporters that Martians were apparently big fans of his new technology and had decided to reach out. 30. Aristotle was arguably the greatest mind of the ancient world, and he published confidently that eels have no parents and no eggs, and simply emerge fully formed from river mud each spring. No reproduction, no biology, just mud spontaneously deciding to become eels on a seasonal schedule. This was not a casual remark. Aristotle wrote it down in his natural history texts as observed fact. His eel theory was accepted and repeated for centuries because when Aristotle said mud makes eels, people believed him. Scientists were still seriously debating eel reproduction well into the 19th century, partly because of this man's confident mud theory. 31. Georges Cuvier was the father of paleontology, and he looked at the fossil record and concluded that God had drowned everything multiple times. Cuvier argued that catastrophic worldwide floods repeatedly wiped out all life on Earth, and that each mass extinction was a separate global deluge, after which new creatures appeared from nowhere. He presented extinction evidence brilliantly, but then explained it with an endless series of divine floods. And Cuvier was so scientifically gifted and so catastrophically wrong about the cause that his career reads like someone correctly solving a murder mystery and then blaming it on a ghost. 32. Humphrey Davy was one of Britain's greatest chemists, and he discovered nitrous oxide, immediately inhaled large quantities of it personally, and then recommended it to physicians as a serious tuberculosis treatment. Davy wrote enthusiastically about laughing gas sessions with his literary friends, including Samuel Taylor Coleridge, turning his laboratory into what sounds like an extremely productive and giggly dinner party. He correctly noted it killed pain, but then suggested it cure lung disease instead of surgery, which was the one application that would have actually saved lives. Aunt Davy essentially invented anesthesia and then filed it under the wrong category for decades. 33. Josiah Nott was a physician who testified before the United States Congress with complete professional confidence that yellow fever was caused by racial mixing. He presented this as established biological science, not personal opinion, and used his medical credentials to give it institutional weight inside America's most powerful legislative chamber. Nott was not a fringe figure whispering at the edges of medicine. He was invited, credentialed, and listened to. American lawmakers sat in their seats and heard a doctor explain infectious disease transmission through racial theory, and apparently nobody in that room stood up and walked out. 34. Wilhelm Fliess was Sigmund Freud's closest friend, personal physician, and intellectual confidant, and he performed nasal surgery to cure menstrual cramps. Fliess had developed a theory connecting the nose to every reproductive and emotional function in the human body, and his treatment for depression, sexual dysfunction, and period pain was to operate on the nasal passages. Freud not only supported this theory but referred patients to Fliess for nasal procedures. One patient nearly died from surgical gauze left inside her nose. Freud initially blamed her for the complication. Their friendship eventually ended, which was probably the healthiest outcome available to anyone involved. 35. T. Percival Lowell was a wealthy Boston astronomer who built his own observatory in Arizona, specifically to study Mars, and spent years carefully mapping what he was absolutely certain was a global canal network built by a dying Martian civilization. Lowell drew detailed charts showing hundreds of straight canals transporting water from the polar ice caps to dry equatorial cities. He published books, gave lectures, and built a devoted following. Other astronomers pointed their telescopes at Mars and saw no canals whatsoever. Lowell looked again and saw them more clearly than ever, which is a completely different problem than a telescope issue. 36. Konrad Lorenz won the Nobel Prize and used his platform to publish a theory about human aggression that compared people to pressurized steam boilers. He argued that aggression builds up as biological pressure inside humans and must periodically explode outward or the vessel ruptures. According to Lorenz, war and violence are not social failures but necessary pressure releases built into our biology. He presented this hydraulic aggression model as science. Psychologists spent decades trying to disprove it experimentally. Lorenz had watched geese for most of his career, and somewhere between the geese and the Nobel stage, he decided he had also solved human violence. 37. Edward Drinker Cope was a brilliant American paleontologist who discovered hundreds of dinosaur species, and also firmly believed that education physically enlarges the human brain across generations. Cope argued that educated parents biologically pass larger, better developed brains directly to their children as an inherited trait, meaning that smart people literally breed smarter offspring in a single generation. He published this as scientific fact. Cope spent his career making genuine fossil discoveries that still matter today, while simultaneously insisting that sending your children to school was literally growing their skulls, which was not how skulls or schools or biology worked at all. 38. William Crookes was a serious experimental physicist who discovered thallium, invented the cathode ray tube, and then announced that his tube could photograph ghosts. Crookes became deeply involved in spiritualism after the death of his brother and began conducting scientific seances, publishing results in peer-reviewed journals. He claimed to have photographed a materialized spirit named Katie King multiple times in controlled laboratory conditions. Fellow scientists were horrified. Crookes insisted his experimental rigor was beyond question. He is remembered today for genuine contributions to physics and for being the man who tried to bring ghost photography into the Royal Society. 39. William Buckland was Britain's first geology professor at Oxford, and he spent his entire distinguished career searching for the specific gravel layer that Noah's flood deposited across the British landscape. Every unusual gravel deposit in England became potential flood evidence. Buckland cataloged them obsessively, wrote papers about them, and brought students to examine them as proof of scripture in geological form. And he eventually admitted the gravel was probably from glaciers rather than the biblical deluge, which took enormous scientific courage. Buckland then pivoted and became a founding figure of glaciology, which is a remarkable career recovery from spending decades hunting for Noah's puddle. 40. Robert Boyle is one of the founders of modern chemistry, and he wrote a completely serious formal scientific treatise defending a magic powder. The powder of sympathy was supposedly rubbed onto a weapon after it had wounded someone, and would then heal that wound from any distance, no matter how far away the injured person had traveled. Boyle examined it, experimented with it, and published his conclusions that it genuinely worked through a natural, sympathetic mechanism he could not yet fully explain. The man who gave the world Boyle's law and helped establish empirical science spent real laboratory time trying to figure out how magic wound powder operates at long range. 41. Francis Galton was already famous for launching the eugenics movement when he decided to take a relaxing walk through British cities and scientifically rate the physical attractiveness of every woman he passed on the street. He carried a small counting device in his pocket, secretly recording attractive versus unattractive faces by town, and compiled the results into what he proudly called a beauty map of Britain. Galton published this as legitimate scientific data. The man who helped found modern statistics used his extraordinary mathematical gifts to build an official ranked attractiveness chart of British women based on secret sidewalk surveillance. 42. John Harvey Kellogg ran a sanitarium in Michigan that was less a hospital and more a monument to his personal obsessions. And one of his signature treatments was the daily yogurt enema. Kellogg believed that harmful bacteria colonizing the colon were responsible for most human disease, and that delivering yogurt rectally was significantly more effective than simply eating it. Patients at his Battle Creek Sanitarium received this treatment as standard daily care. Kellogg was simultaneously serving yogurt at the breakfast table and administering it from the opposite direction downstairs, operating what was essentially a full yogurt-based medical system running on 2 tracks at once. 43. Thomas Wright was an 18th century astronomer who made genuinely important contributions to understanding the structure of the Milky Way, and also published a serious hypothesis that heaven is a physical location sitting at the geometric center of the galaxy. Not a metaphor, not a spiritual concept, but an actual physical address in space that God occupies at the mathematical middle of the Milky Way. Wright drew diagrams, did calculations, and presented this as reasonable astronomical thinking. He correctly deduced that the Milky Way is a disc-shaped system of stars, and then dropped divine real estate coordinates into the same paper like it was completely natural. 44. Buffon was France's greatest naturalist, and he developed a theory about America that infuriated every single person on the continent. He argued that the climate and air of the New World caused all animals and people living there to become physically smaller, weaker, and less fertile than their European counterparts, while American animals were degenerating versions of superior European originals, according to Buffon's published science. Thomas Jefferson was so personally offended that he had a full-grown moose shipped from Vermont to Paris specifically to drop it in front of Buffon as biological counter-evidence. The moose apparently made its point more effectively than any academic rebuttal. 45. Sigmund Freud built an entire interpretive system around dreams, and inside that system he published that dreams about staircases, ladders, and steps always represent sexual intercourse without any possible exceptions. Not sometimes, not usually, but always and universally in every case. Freud's dream interpretation framework was constructed so that almost any object or action connected to something sexual, but staircases were one of his explicit published certainties. If a patient dreamed about climbing stairs, Freud considered the matter settled before the session began. The father of psychoanalysis looked at staircases and saw one thing only, which explains a lot about his therapy sessions. 46. Charles Wheatstone helped invent the telegraph and then publicly speculated that the logical next step was transmitting physical objects through the wires. Not data representing objects, not descriptions of objects, but actual compressed matter squeezed into electrical signals and delivered down telegraph cables to be reassembled at the other end. Wheatstone suggested this as a reasonable extension of communication technology to audiences who apparently did not immediately laugh him out of the room. The man who helped wire the world together with instant communication looked at his telegraph cables and genuinely wondered if you could eventually mail a sandwich through them. 47. Clarence King was the first director of the United States Geological Survey, one of the most prestigious scientific positions in American government. And he spent his career arguing that American mountain ranges did not rise gradually, but exploded upward in sudden, violent catastrophes. King rejected the careful gradualism that was becoming the foundation of geology and insisted that America's landscape was shaped by rapid, dramatic explosions of geological force. He ran the federal agency responsible for mapping and understanding American geology while fundamentally disagreeing with how geology works. And King surveyed the American West with genuine skill and then explained what he found with a theory his own colleagues considered theatrical. 48. Carl Scheele was an extraordinarily gifted Swedish chemist who discovered oxygen, chlorine, manganese, and several other elements, and he tasted nearly every single one of them. Scheele's laboratory method included taking detailed flavor notes on newly discovered chemical compounds, including arsenic, hydrogen cyanide, and various lead compounds, documenting their tastes with the same careful attention he gave their other properties. His colleagues apparently considered this a legitimate research technique. Scheele died at 43 years old, which, given his hobby of personally taste-testing arsenic and cyanide, is either a tragedy, an inevitability, or both, depending on how generously you want to read his laboratory notebooks. 49. William McDougall was a Harvard psychologist who trained rats to navigate mazes and then published peer-reviewed scientific data claiming that the untrained offspring of his maze rats got faster each generation without any training at all. McDougall argued this proved that acquired skills are biologically inherited, meaning that what parents learn gets passed directly into their children's nervous systems. He ran the experiment for years, published multiple papers, and other researchers could not replicate his results. McDougall stood by his data anyway. Harvard's psychology department spent considerable energy distancing itself from the professor who was teaching that rat parents can genetically text their children directions. 50. Horace Wells was a Connecticut dentist who genuinely discovered that nitrous oxide could eliminate surgical pain and decided the best way to prove it was a live demonstration at Harvard Medical School in front of the most important surgeons in America. Wells administered the gas to a volunteer patient and began the procedure. The patient screamed loudly throughout the entire surgery. The Harvard audience booed Wells off the stage and dismissed him as a fraud. Wells had actually stumbled onto one of medicine's greatest discoveries, but gave his patient an insufficient dose at the single most important moment of his career, turning a breakthrough into a public humiliation. 51. Giovanni Schiaparelli was a respected Italian astronomer who tracked seasonal color changes on Mars for decades and published his conclusion that the shifting greens and browns spreading across the Martian surface every year were proof of large-scale plant life blooming each spring. Schiaparelli watched Mars turn green on a seasonal cycle and decided the only reasonable explanation was vegetation. He mapped these color changes carefully and presented them as observational evidence of a living planet. Modern science eventually determined the color changes were dust storms and mineral oxidation, which is significantly less exciting than an entire planet's worth of alien crops changing color on a schedule. 52. Aristotle published in multiple written works that women have fewer teeth than men, and stated this as verified anatomical fact that he had personally observed and confirmed. Aristotle was married twice. He had direct access to multiple women across his entire adult lifetime. He wrote about teeth specifically and authoritatively. At no point during his marriages or his decades of scientific observation did Aristotle apparently think to ask either of his wives to open their mouths so he could count. His tooth claim was repeated as medical fact for centuries, because when the greatest philosopher alive says something about teeth, people believe him without checking. 53. Ivan Pavlov is famous for conditioning dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. But his larger ambition was classifying all of human personality into 4 rigid biological types based on the physical thickness, flexibility, and signal speed of nervous system tissue. Pavlov believed that every human being alive fit neatly into one of his 4 categories, and that these categories were determined entirely by the physical properties of their nerve fibers. He applied the same framework he used on dogs directly to humans and presented it as a complete theory of personality. Pavlov rang his bell and apparently decided it explained everything about everybody. 54. Lee de Forest invented the vacuum tube, one of the most important components in the history of electronics, and publicly stated that transmitting the human voice wirelessly through the air was a complete scientific impossibility, and that anyone seriously claiming it could be done was simply lying. De Forest called wireless voice transmission a hoax. He said this with the full confidence of a man who had dedicated his life to understanding electrical signals. 6 years after his impossibility declaration, commercial radio broadcasts began reaching millions of American homes, and De Forest spent the rest of his career as the man who called radio a lie. 55. Matthew Fontaine Maury was America's first serious oceanographer, and he mapped the floor of the Atlantic Ocean as a flat, featureless bowl of gray ooze stretching uniformly from continent to continent with no mountains, valleys, ridges, or trenches of any kind. Maury was a genuine pioneer who revolutionized naval navigation and wind mapping, and when he turned his attention to the ocean floor, he drew a completely flat bathtub. The Atlantic Ocean floor is actually one of the most geologically dramatic landscapes on Earth, containing the longest mountain range on the planet. Maury's flat ooze bowl was off by approximately 45,000 miles of underwater mountains. 56. Antoine Lavoisier revolutionized chemistry by identifying oxygen and hydrogen and demolishing centuries of alchemical nonsense, and then proposed that heat is a real physical fluid called caloric that flows in and out of objects the way water moves between containers. Hot objects were simply full of caloric fluid. Cold objects had lost their caloric. When you warmed something up, you were pouring invisible heat fluid into it. Lavoisier included caloric on his official list of chemical elements alongside oxygen and nitrogen. The man who cleaned up chemistry by removing imaginary substances added his own imaginary substance to the official periodic table and defended it as rigorous science. 57. Carl Vogt was a prominent German scientist who published formal academic work, arguing that women's brains are evolutionarily inferior to men's, permanently frozen at a juvenile stage of male brain development. Vogt claimed women were biologically closer to children and primitive humans than to adult European men, and he backed this with skull measurements and brain weight comparisons that he considered conclusive. European universities invited him to lecture. Scientific societies published his papers. Vogt built a distinguished academic career, presenting the intellectual inferiority of half the human population as a measurable biological fact, and the institutions around him responded with tenure and applause. 58. Franz Joseph Gall founded phrenology by mapping 27 distinct mental and moral faculties onto specific bumps on the human skull, creating a complete personality reading system based entirely on head shape. Gall's bump map included a dedicated murder bump located just behind the ear, a bump for religious feeling, a bump for mathematical ability, and a bump for love of children. Physicians, lawyers, and employers across America and Europe paid to have skulls professionally read. Gall was invited to courts as an expert witness on criminal character. An entire diagnostic industry built itself on the assumption that a lump behind someone's ear meant they were thinking about murder. 59. John James Audubon painted the most celebrated bird illustrations in American history and published plates showing birds frozen in mid-flight by rattlesnake hypnosis, genuinely believing that snakes paralyze birds with their gaze before striking. Audubon documented what he called snake fascination in multiple published works, describing birds hovering motionless in the air, unable to flee, held in place entirely by the reptile's stare. Naturalists at the time pushed back and told him he was wrong. Audubon had painted thousands of birds with extraordinary scientific accuracy and simultaneously believed that snakes had developed a superpower that made birds stop flying through sheer eye contact. Part 60. Christian Huygens discovered Saturn's rings, identified its largest moon, and built some of the finest telescopes of the 17th century, and then used those telescopes to conclude that Jupiter is definitely inhabited and that its residents must be roughly human-sized. Huygens calculated this by working out how large a Jovian person's hands would need to be to comfortably handle tools proportional to the size of Jupiter. He published this planetary hand-size reasoning in a serious astronomical text. Huygens correctly described Saturn's rings, contributed enormously to optics and physics, and spent part of his intellectual life carefully calculating the grip width of imaginary Jupiter people. 61. Herbert Spencer had already argued that poor people should starve for the good of civilization when he turned his evolutionary theories toward women, and published that female brains were biologically dangerous to female bodies. Spencer argued that thinking too hard diverted vital biological energy away from the uterus, meaning that educated women were literally starving their own reproductive systems by using their minds. He presented this as straightforward physiological science. Spencer was one of the most widely read intellectuals in Victorian America, which means thousands of people read his work and genuinely worried that their daughters were harming themselves by finishing their homework. 62. C. Edward Suess was a brilliant Austrian geologist who correctly identified several major geological formations and spent years arguing that all the continents were once connected by massive land bridges that subsequently sank beneath the ocean. When the bridges sank, previously connected animal populations became separated and evolved differently, which Suess used to explain why similar fossils appeared on different continents. The theory was almost right in its observations and completely wrong in its mechanism. The continents themselves moved, which Suess never considered. He spent his career building an elaborate system of sunken bridges to explain something that was actually just the ground underneath him slowly drifting sideways. 63. Lot Justus von Liebig was one of the 19th century's most influential chemists, and he became convinced that beef extract, the thick brown paste left after boiling down enormous quantities of meat, was a complete nutritional replacement for all normal human food. Liebig commercialized his beef extract and marketed it specifically to feed the poor as a total food substitute, claiming it contained all necessary nutrition in concentrated form. Doctors endorsed it. Governments considered it. Poor communities across Europe received Liebig's extract as a serious poverty nutrition solution. The extract turned out to contain almost no actual nutritional value whatsoever, making it an extremely expensive and useless brown paste. 64. Samuel George Morton spent his career measuring human skull capacities across different racial groups and published ranked tables that he presented as definitive scientific proof of racial intelligence hierarchies. Morton was considered America's greatest scientist by many of his contemporaries, and his skull data was cited in Congress, in courts, and in universities across the country. Decades after his death, researchers went back and re-examined Morton's original measurements and discovered he had unconsciously manipulated his own data, rounding numbers in ways that consistently favored his predetermined conclusions. The most cited scientific racist in American history had managed to fool even himself with his own measurements. 65. George Beard was a New York neurologist who looked at modern American life in 1880 and diagnosed the entire country as sick with a new disease he named American nervousness. Beard argued that modern technology, including telegraphs, trains, newspapers, and business pressure, was literally draining the finite supply of nerve force that every human body contains. Americans were running out of nervous energy because civilization was moving too fast for biology to keep up. Beard's diagnosis was taken seriously by physicians across the country. He essentially invented the concept of burnout in 1880, blamed it on the telegraph, and prescribed rest cures to an entire exhausted nation of people he believed were simply running low on nerve juice. 66. Thomas Dick was a Scottish minister and amateur astronomer who calculated the population of the moon by dividing the total lunar surface area by the minimum personal space required per human being, and arrived at a figure of over 4 billion lunar inhabitants. Dick applied this same population density formula to the rings of Saturn and concluded they housed over 8 trillion residents. He published these calculations in serious astronomical texts and was widely read across America and Britain. Dick built his entire extraterrestrial population census on the assumption that God would never waste usable surface area, turning square mileage into a theological argument for alien neighbors. 67. Pliny the Elder documented in his encyclopedia that menstrual blood is one of the most destructive substances in the natural world, now capable of killing crops on contact, turning wine sour, rusting iron, causing dogs to go permanently rabid, and making bees abandon their hives entirely. Pliny listed these effects as verified natural observations in the same encyclopedia where he documented real geography, real animals, and real historical events. Roman farmers apparently took this seriously. Pliny compiled 37 volumes of the most ambitious natural history ever written in the ancient world and tucked a menstrual blood apocalypse theory in there between his chapters on agriculture and zoology. 68. Cesare Lombroso had already argued that criminals are born with identifiable physical features when he published a follow-up theory specifically about women. Lombroso argued that female criminals are actually more dangerous than male criminals because female evolutionary throwbacks are better at concealing their primitive nature behind conventional social behavior. A criminal woman was not just a criminal, but a master of disguise hiding ancient savagery under a respectable surface. Lombroso presented this at academic conferences across Europe to enthusiastic applause. He had essentially argued that normal-looking women were the most dangerous kind, which is a remarkable conclusion to reach through what he called rigorous criminal anthropology. 69. William Sturgeon invented the electromagnet, made a genuine and lasting contribution to electrical science, and then turned his speculative attention to the future of communication and publicly predicted that telegraphs would eventually carry actual physical newspapers through the wires to subscribers. Not digital text, not data, but real paper newspapers compressed somehow into electrical signals and reassembled in living rooms across the country. Sturgeon imagined a future where Americans would subscribe to a wire newspaper delivery service that pushed physical print journalism through copper cables into their homes. The man who built the electromagnet apparently drew no practical limits on what electromagnetism could eventually be convinced to transport. 70. Matthew Fontaine Maury mapped ocean currents with genuine scientific precision, and then published that the source of the Gulf Stream was a biblical river mentioned in the Book of Psalms. Maury believed scripture contained encoded geographical information that serious scientists were obligated to investigate, and he used a passage about pathways in the seas as navigational evidence pointing him toward the Gulf Stream's origin. Maury was a founding figure of oceanography, a man who understood currents better than almost anyone alive, and he cross-referenced his ocean maps with the Old Testament, like they were two equally reliable sources of hydrological data sitting on the same shelf. 71. Samuel Hahnemann founded homeopathy on two ideas that work together to form one of history's most creative medical arguments. First, mind that substances causing symptoms in healthy people cure those same symptoms in sick people. Second, and more remarkably, that the more you dilute a medicine in water, the stronger it becomes. Hahnemann believed water remembers what was dissolved in it and carries the healing memory even after the original substance is completely undetectable. He diluted medicines to the point where not a single molecule of the original ingredient remained and declared the resulting water more powerful than the concentrated version. Homeopathy is still a billion-dollar global industry built entirely on this premise. 72. Henry Goddard invented IQ testing in America and was so alarmed by his own results that he lobbied the United States government to sterilize everyone he classified as feeble-minded before they could reproduce. Goddard brought his test to Ellis Island and screened arriving immigrants, classifying enormous percentages of Russians, Jews, Italians, and Hungarians as mentally deficient based on tests administered in English to people who had just survived a transatlantic voyage. He presented these results to Congress as a hereditary emergency requiring immediate legislative action. Goddard's testing methodology was catastrophically flawed, his conclusions were catastrophically wrong, and his recommendations shaped American immigration and sterilization policy for decades anyway. 73. Sylvester Graham invented the graham cracker for the exact same reason John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes, which tells you something disturbing about 19th century American food reformers and their relationship with human desire. Graham genuinely believed that spicy, flavorful, stimulating food excited the body into immoral behavior, and that bland, unseasoned crackers would calm those urges down to a manageable and virtuous level. He traveled across America lecturing on dietary sexual restraint to enormous crowds. Graham cracker fans today buying s'mores ingredients at grocery stores are technically purchasing a 19th century anti-desire medical device that a deeply anxious man invented because he was extremely worried about what flavor does to people. 74. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck developed the first serious scientific theory of evolution, before Darwin and his central mechanism was spectacularly wrong in the most charming possible way. Lamarck argued that giraffes stretch their necks reaching for high leaves, that this physical stretching made their necks incrementally longer during their lifetimes, and that this acquired length was then biologically inherited by their offspring. Use a muscle intensely enough and your children inherit bigger muscles. Lamarck genuinely believed organisms pass their lifetime physical achievements directly to the next generation like biological trophies. He got evolution completely right in spirit, completely wrong in mechanism, and gave the world the most optimistic theory of inheritance ever proposed. 75. Johann Elert Bode was a German astronomer who noticed that the distances between known planets followed a rough mathematical pattern and became so convinced by this numerical sequence that he declared a planet must exist between Mars and Jupiter because the math demanded one. Bode announced the missing planet with complete confidence before anyone had found it, essentially inventing a celestial body through arithmetic enthusiasm. Astronomers began searching the gap and eventually discovered Ceres. Bode was vindicated, celebrated, and then Neptune was discovered in a location his mathematical pattern completely failed to predict, quietly suggesting that the universe does not actually organize its planets around what German astronomers find numerically satisfying. 76. Joseph Henry was America's greatest electrical scientist before Edison, and he made genuine breakthroughs in electromagnetism that still matter today. And he also argued that electrical current traveling through copper wire was essentially a physical form of mental telepathy. Henry believed electricity moved at the speed of human thought itself, and that the telegraph was not just a communication device, but a mechanical externalization of the thinking process. He presented this as a serious philosophical observation about the nature of electricity and mind. Henry correctly described how electromagnets work, and then decided the wires connecting them were philosophically equivalent to the inside of someone's brain. 77. Friedrich Serturner discovered morphine, which is one of the most significant medical discoveries in history, and immediately began taking it himself daily as a personal experiment. Serturner published enthusiastic reports about morphine's effects from first-hand experience, recommended it publicly as a superior replacement for alcohol addiction, and argued that morphine was a safer and more civilized habit than drinking. He specifically marketed it as an alcohol cure. Morphine, as the world eventually discovered at enormous human cost, is among the most addictive substances ever identified. Serturner discovered one of medicine's greatest painkillers, got thoroughly addicted to it, and then spent years recommending it to alcoholics as a lifestyle upgrade. 78. Charles Davenport was America's leading eugenicist, and he spent his career publishing studies claiming that specific human behaviors are single inherited Mendelian genes passed down exactly like eye color. His most remarkable published claim was that love of the sea is a single genetic trait he called thalassophilia, which he traced carefully through American naval families across generations as evidence of a saltwater gene. Davenport published this in serious scientific journals. He also claimed wanderlust, shiftlessness, and pauperism were single inheritable genes. Davenport ran the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, America's most prestigious genetics research station, while cataloging human personality traits like they were pea plant flower colors in Mendel's garden. 79. Charles-Édouard Brown-Séquard was a distinguished French neurologist who at age 72 injected himself with a liquid mixture of crushed dog and guinea pig testicle extract, and then stood before the French Biological Society and announced that it had reversed his aging, restored his strength, and dramatically improved his mental clarity. He reported being able to climb stairs more easily and work longer hours. Brown-Séquard began offering the extract to other elderly men and reported widespread rejuvenation. The scientific community was skeptical. Modern analysis confirmed the extract contained almost no active hormones whatsoever. Brown-Séquard had injected himself with crushed animal parts and experienced what was almost certainly the most consequential placebo effect of the 19th century. 80. Aristotle argued that the brain's only biological function is to cool the blood, like a radiator mounted inside the skull to prevent the body from overheating. All thought, emotion, memory, consciousness, and personality lived inside the heart according to Aristotle, which is why we still say broken heart instead of broken brain and fall in love instead of fall into neurological bonding responses. Aristotle was the most rigorous observer of the natural world in the ancient world, and he looked at the human brain and concluded it was a cooling unit. He was so confident and so wrong that cardiology and neuroscience spent centuries untangling the confusion his heart-brain reversal left behind. 81. Ernst Chladni was a German physicist who discovered that sand sprinkled on a vibrating metal plate arranges itself into beautiful geometric patterns depending on the frequency of the vibration. This was a genuine and important discovery in acoustics. Chladni then looked at these sand patterns and concluded they were the hidden geometric blueprint of all matter in the universe and the fundamental structural language of cosmic order itself. He published this as a serious philosophical extension of his acoustic research. Chladni correctly described how sound waves create geometric forms, and then decided he had accidentally discovered the secret architecture God used to design physical reality. 82. Edward Thorndike was one of the most influential psychologists in American educational history, and he argued that intelligence is a single fixed number, like height or shoe size, that completely and permanently defines a person's total mental capacity for their entire lifetime. Thorndike built testing systems around this single number and shaped American public education policy for decades, based on the idea that one score captures everything worth knowing about a human mind. He designed the educational infrastructure that sorted American children into tracks based on fixed intelligence measurements. Thorndike spent his career building a system that treated the full complexity of human thinking as something that fit neatly inside one number on a chart. 83. Elihu Thomson was a serious electrical engineer who made genuine contributions to AC power technology, and then lobbied the United States Congress with case studies claiming that people living near alternating current power lines were spontaneously developing insanity from the electrical fields. Thomson compiled patient profiles, documented symptoms, and presented what he called clinical evidence that AC current was quietly driving residential neighborhoods into madness. He was doing this at roughly the same time Edison was electrocuting animals to make the same anti-AC argument. Two of America's most accomplished electrical engineers spent significant professional energy trying to convince the government that the technology powering modern civilization was a neighborhood-scale mental health emergency. 84. Warren Upham was a respected American geologist who looked at the Great Lakes and proposed that each one of the 5 lakes was formed by a separate, catastrophic meteor impact, mapping each lake to a specific ancient crater event. Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario each got their own extinction-level impact in Upham's model, making the American Midwest the most meteorologically unlucky region in planetary history. The Great Lakes were actually carved by glaciers over thousands of years, which is dramatic enough without requiring 5 separate asteroid strikes. Upham examined one of the most geologically well-documented landscapes in North America and concluded it looked like something had repeatedly bombed it from space. 85. J.J. Thomson discovered the electron, which is one of the most important discoveries in the history of physics. And his model for how electrons sit inside an atom is called the plum pudding model. because he proposed that electrons are embedded in a uniform ball of positive charge exactly like raisins suspended in a Christmas pudding. R. Thomson won the Nobel Prize for discovering the electron and then described its home as a dessert. The plum pudding model was wrong, as Ernest Rutherford demonstrated by shooting particles at gold foil, but Thomson had successfully discovered a subatomic particle and named its theoretical housing after a British holiday baked good, which is a very specific kind of scientific legacy. 86. Carl Vogt had already published that women's brains are evolutionarily inferior when he returned to the subject to argue that women educating themselves above elementary school level would cause entire civilizations to regress. Vogt claimed that educated women disrupted their natural reproductive biological role, producing fewer children and weaker offspring. And that female intellectual ambition was therefore a civilizational threat requiring institutional discouragement. He presented this regression theory at European universities to receptive academic audiences. Vogt built a long and celebrated scientific career arguing that the single greatest danger to human progress was women finishing their education, and European institutions kept inviting him back to explain it again. 87. John Harvey Kellogg had already invented cornflakes to suppress desire and was administering yogurt enemas as standard medical care when he published a warning that sleeping under an electric blanket deteriorates the nervous system. Kellogg argued that electric blankets interfere with the body's natural vital electrical current, disrupting the nervous system during sleep in ways that accumulate into serious health damage over time. He ran a sanitarium, sold health products, published books, and broadcast warnings about electrical bedding to his enormous American following. Kellogg was so comprehensively worried about the human body that he found a way to make sleeping warm into a medical crisis requiring his personal intervention and published guidance. 88. Buffon had already argued that American animals were physically inferior to European ones when he published a separate natural history claim that newborn bear cubs are born as completely shapeless blobs of flesh with no recognizable bear features whatsoever. According to Buffon, mother bears spend days after birth physically licking their formless cubs into the correct bear shape, sculpting ears, snouts, and limbs from the raw biological material with their tongues. This was published in one of the most widely read natural history encyclopedias of the 18th century. Buffon was France's greatest naturalist, and he looked at bear reproduction and concluded that ursine mothers are essentially sculptors working in a medium that is also their child. 89. Charles Darwin proposed pangenesis as his personal theory of inheritance, and it is the most un-Darwin idea Darwin ever had. He argued that tiny particles he called gemmules, shed from every cell in your body throughout your lifetime, migrate through your bloodstream to your reproductive organs and carry your experiences, injuries, and acquired characteristics into your children. If you lost a finger, your gemmules carried that information. If you learned a language, your gemmules transmitted it. Darwin spent years defending pangenesis, even as evidence mounted against it. The man who correctly described natural selection proposed a hereditary mechanism that would have made Lamarck, his intellectual rival, feel completely vindicated. 90. Josiah Nott published detailed statistical tables ranking mixed-race people's life expectancy by precise degree of racial mixture, presenting shortened lifespans as measurable biological science with specific numbers attached to specific racial combinations. Nott testified before Congress, published in medical journals, and lectured at universities, building an academic career on biometric racism presented with the full apparatus of 19th century scientific credibility. He assigned precise numbers to his conclusions, which made them look like data rather than ideology. Nott understood that putting a specific figure on a claim makes audiences treat it as science regardless of how the figure was obtained, which is a lesson about the appearance of precision that the 19th century learned extremely badly. 91. Konrad Lorenz had already compared human aggression to a steam boiler when he published a follow-up argument that city living was biologically degenerating the human species through artificial selection. Lorenz argued that urban environments were selecting for docile, intellectually dulled, cognitively inferior humans the same way domestication produces tamer and stupider animals. City people were essentially domesticating themselves into a weaker subspecies through the simple act of living near each other in apartment buildings. R. Lorenz won the Nobel Prize, watched geese in rural Austria, and concluded that anyone living in a city was participating in their own species-level cognitive downgrade without realizing it. 92. Thomas Wright had already placed heaven at the geometric center of the Milky Way when he extended his theological astronomy to other galaxies and published that each separate galaxy in the universe is governed by its own individual deity, running independent divine experiments on its resident civilizations. Wright proposed a multiverse of parallel gods, each managing their own galactic jurisdiction, which is either the most ambitious theological argument ever made or the most ambitious science fiction premise of the 18th century, depending on how generously you read it. See, Wright correctly intuited that the Milky Way is one of many galaxies and then populated each of them with a separate god as a logical next step. 93. James McKean. Cattell built a reaction time laboratory at Columbia University and spent years testing how quickly subjects responded to a flash of light, convinced that response speed was a direct and accurate measurement of human intelligence. Cattell believed the fastest reactors were the most intelligent people and built an entire testing program around this assumption, measuring thousands of Columbia students with his light flash apparatus. His data showed essentially zero correlation between reaction speed and any other measure of mental ability. And Cattell had spent years and considerable university resources building the world's most elaborate system for proving that fast reflexes and intelligence are completely unrelated, which was important to know, but not what he intended to discover. 94. Oliver Lodge was a distinguished British physicist who made genuine contributions to electromagnetic theory, and spent the second half of his career absolutely certain that the ether, the invisible medium he believed filled all of space, was real, and that sufficiently sensitive instruments could detect the thoughts of recently dead people passing through it. Lodge lost his son in World War I and became deeply committed to spiritualism, attending seances and publishing books about communicating with the dead. So he insisted his physics background made him a more reliable observer of supernatural phenomena, not a less reliable one. Lodge built legitimate science and then spent his later years listening very carefully to empty rooms for messages from the deceased. 95. Philip Henry Gosse was a respected British naturalist who responded to Darwin's evidence for an ancient Earth with a proposal so audacious it offended both scientists and theologians simultaneously. Gosse argued that God created the Earth exactly 6,000 years ago, but built fake fossils, false geological strata, and artificial age markers directly into the rock specifically to test whether humans would trust scientific evidence or divine scripture. The Earth was young but designed to look old as a faith examination. Scientists called it unfalsifiable nonsense, and theologians called it an accusation that God deliberately deceives his creation. Gosse had managed to produce a theory that nobody on either side of the debate wanted anything to do with. 96. Johann Gadolin was a Finnish chemist who discovered the element yttrium and made genuine contributions to chemistry, and also spent part of his career defending the existence of frigorific particles, a separate cold fluid completely distinct from heat. Gadolin argued that cold and heat were not opposite ends of the same spectrum, but two entirely different physical substances, each with its own particles flowing through matter independently. Heat flowed in, cold flowed in, and temperature was determined by which fluid was winning the contest inside an object at any given moment. Gadolin correctly identified a new element and simultaneously believed that winter was made of a specific invisible cold substance that flows into things like water into a sponge. 97. Lothrop Stoddard was an American writer and race theorist who appeared before American audiences in the early 20th century and argued that non-white immigration was not just a cultural or economic issue, but a literal biological attack on white brain cells. Stoddard used blood transfusion metaphors to describe immigration as a dilution process, claiming that mixing populations was physically degrading white neurological tissue at the cellular level. He published best-selling books, lectured at universities, and was cited favorably in Congress during immigration debates. Stoddard dressed race theory in biological language precise enough to sound scientific to audiences who wanted scientific permission to believe what they already believed. 98. Benjamin Rush had already been draining his yellow fever patients nearly to death through bloodletting when he developed a separate psychiatric treatment involving a spinning board. Rush strapped mentally ill patients onto a rotating wooden board and spun them at high speed, believing that centrifugal force would redistribute excess blood away from the brain and restore mental balance. Patients were strapped down and whirled around like a medical carnival ride as treatment for depression, mania, and psychosis. Rush is called the father of American psychiatry and has his portrait on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association. His spinning board patients would probably have complicated feelings about that particular honor. 99. William Whewell was a Victorian polymath who coined the words scientist and physicist and argued theologically that every planet in the universe must be inhabited because an omnipotent God would never create usable surface area and then leave it empty. Whewell calculated minimum planet sizes capable of supporting life and used these calculations to argue that any planet above his threshold was divinely obligated to contain residents. He presented this as a logical deduction from the nature of an efficient creator. Whewell gave science two of its most useful words and spent part of his intellectual energy arguing that God is too practical to build empty planets, which is a theological argument dressed in the vocabulary of real estate. 100. Linus Pauling won 2 Nobel Prizes, one for chemistry and one for peace, making him one of the most decorated scientists in history. And he spent the final decades of his life campaigning with absolute certainty that taking massive doses of vitamin C cures cancer and the common cold. Pauling took enormous quantities of vitamin C daily, recommended it to everyone, wrote best-selling books about it, and actively opposed conventional chemotherapy for cancer patients. Clinical trials repeatedly failed to support his claims. Pauling died at 93, still completely convinced he was right and that the medical establishment was wrong, leaving behind a scientific legacy that splits cleanly into the part that changed the world and the part that sold a lot of orange juice. 101. Robert Bean was a physician at Johns Hopkins University who published peer-reviewed measurements in 1906, claiming that the frontal lobes of Black Americans were anatomically smaller than those of white Americans, presenting this as objective neurological science with precise measurements attached. Bean used his institutional prestige and medical credentials to give his racial brain size claims the full weight of American academic medicine. His supervisor, Franklin Mall, later re-examined the exact same brain samples without knowing which race each belonged to and found absolutely no size difference whatsoever. And Bean had measured the same brains and seen completely different results because he already knew what answer he was looking for before he started measuring. 102. G. Stanley Hall founded the American Psychological Association, mentored an entire generation of American psychologists, and published a theory that adolescence is a biological replay of pre-human savagery, where teenagers temporarily re-experience primitive evolutionary stages inside their own bodies. Hall argued that a 13-year-old is not just going through puberty, but is biologically reliving an ancient stage of human prehistory, complete with the aggression and irrationality of early hominids. Parents nodded along because teenagers do seem somewhat feral. Hall built a serious academic framework around the idea that every American high school contains students who are temporarily and biologically reverting to a more primitive version of the species on a developmental schedule. 103. Lewis Henry Morgan was an American anthropologist who declared that all human civilizations across history must pass through identical evolutionary stages in a fixed sequence, and that every society on Earth was inevitably progressing toward American-style democracy as the final and highest stage of human development. Morgan presented this as scientific law, not opinion. Other cultures were not different. They were simply earlier on the same path that America had already completed. Morgan's framework was enormously influential in American academic circles and was used to justify colonial policies by classifying colonized peoples as scientifically earlier versions of the civilization that was colonizing them, which was convenient for everyone except the people being colonized. 104. Warren de la Rue was a dedicated solar photographer who spent years capturing images of the sun and argued that solar prominences, the massive plasma eruptions visible at the sun's edge during eclipses, were physical evidence of a solid cool surface hiding beneath the photosphere. De La Rue looked at enormous columns of superheated plasma exploding off a nuclear fireball and concluded they were proof of temperate solid ground underneath. And he was genuinely trying to resolve a serious scientific debate about the sun's physical nature using the best photographic technology available to him, and arrived at an answer that required the sun to be simultaneously on fire on the outside and pleasantly habitable just underneath. 105. Samuel Forey was a United States Army surgeon who published a formal medical paper arguing that hot tropical climates biologically alter human skin pigmentation within a single lifetime, meaning that environment literally blackens skin in one generation of exposure to southern heat. Forey presented this as established biological science with observational evidence drawn from his military medical practice. He was attempting to explain racial difference through environmental mechanism, rather than separate creation, which was considered progressive thinking in his era. Forey got the progressive instinct partially right and the biology spectacularly wrong, proposing a mechanism for racial diversity that required the human body to operate like a piece of fabric left too long in direct sunlight. 106. Edward Drinker Cope had already argued that education physically grows the brain across generations when he published a separate racial theory, arguing that human facial features could be scientifically ranked on a scale, measuring how close each group remained to a juvenile ancestral skull shape. Cope believed that some racial groups had evolved further from the primitive juvenile template than others, and that skull measurements proved the ranking. He was simultaneously one of America's greatest fossil hunters, discovering hundreds of dinosaur species that bear his name in the scientific record, and a man who spent part of his career building a racial hierarchy out of skull geometry. Both things were happening in the same brain at the same time. 107. Orson Squire Fowler brought phrenology to the American masses by taking it out of the academic lecture hall and turning it into a traveling entertainment and diagnostic service. Fowler read skull bumps at public shows across America, selling personalized phrenology charts that diagnosed criminal tendencies, romantic compatibility, and professional aptitude from the shape of a person's head. Americans lined up enthusiastically to have their skulls professionally evaluated. Fowler was not a fringe performer but a mainstream celebrity whose charts were taken seriously by employers making hiring decisions and by individuals making life choices based on the specific topology of their own craniums. He made head reading one of the most popular self-improvement activities in 19th century America. 108. Henry Cavendish was one of the most brilliant experimental scientists of the 18th century, famously reclusive, and he believed that electricity is a single fluid that flows from areas of excess to areas of deficit, with positive charge simply meaning too much fluid and negative charge meaning not enough. Cavendish built his entire electrical theory around this one fluid model and conducted extraordinarily precise experiments to support it. And he was so reclusive that he never published most of his findings, meaning other scientists independently rediscovered his work decades later. Cavendish correctly measured numerous electrical phenomena and explained them all using an invisible fluid that does not exist, achieving remarkable experimental accuracy with a completely fictional mechanism. 109. Richard Proctor was a popular British astronomer who argued that the sun has a temperate habitable zone sitting just beneath its photosphere where permanent solid land exists, shielded from the heat above by insulating cloud layers. Proctor believed the sun's interior was not uniformly burning, but structured in layers with a cool, livable surface hidden underneath the fiery outer atmosphere like a comfortable room beneath a burning roof. He wrote popular astronomy books read by enormous audiences across Britain and America, and used them to argue that the sun is not just a star, but potentially someone's home address, with the fire being essentially a very aggressive weather system rather than the entire point of the sun. 110. Granville Stanley Hall had already argued that women reading novels caused infertility when he published his formal academic position that educating women past elementary school diverts reproductive energy directly away from the uterus, making advanced female education a biological danger to the entire species. Hall presented this as physiological science grounded in the body's finite energy budget. He argued that brains and uteruses compete for the same limited biological resources and that classrooms were winning at the uterus's expense. Hall founded the American Psychological Association, shaped American educational policy, mentored dozens of influential psychologists, and spent a significant portion of his distinguished career trying to convince America that sending girls to high school was a medical emergency. 111. George Westinghouse was the man who brought alternating current to American homes, won the war of currents against Edison, and powered modern civilization. And he publicly backed a plan to replace all of that electrical wiring with pneumatic steam pipe networks running under city streets as the inevitable infrastructure of the American urban future. Westinghouse invested serious money and credibility into pneumatic tube technology, envisioning a city where steam-powered pipes handled everything that wires currently managed. The man who wired America looked at his own invention and decided pipes were probably going to win eventually. Westinghouse powered the 20th century and simultaneously bet against the technology he had just spent his entire career installing everywhere. And there you have it, 111 of the most educated, celebrated, and genuinely brilliant minds in human history being spectacularly, confidently, and sometimes dangerously wrong. These were not random people. These were the geniuses, the award winners, the professors, the founders of entire scientific fields, and every single one of them looked the world dead in the eye and said, "Trust me, I have done the math." So the next time someone with an impressive title tells you they have all the answers, just remember the guy who thought the sun had neighbors, the man who invented cornflakes to stop desire, and the Nobel Prize winner who really believed orange juice cured cancer. If you enjoyed watching history embarrass its smartest people, hit that like button, subscribe to Dumb History, and drop a comment telling us which one of these geniuses you think was the absolute dumbest. We will see you in the next one.